Hi, welcome to this podcast for the Social Work Action Network. My name is Michael Lavalette from Swan UK, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined on the podcast today by Angus. Ian is well known in terms of his writing and campaigning work in the fields of both social ecological campaigns. He is the author of numerous articles and books on the climate crisis. Perhaps his most important work is Facing the Anthropocene and also Too Many People. And he's also the editor of the excellent online journal Climate and Capitalism. Ian, welcome to the podcast. It's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Michael. I'm glad to be here.
So, Ian, I've got a number of questions to go through, but we're obviously in the midst of the COVID crisis, and we've maybe forgotten what happened just before COVID struck the world, but we've just been through some quite traumatic events in Australia, and it seemed to be that a number of papers, a number of media outlets suddenly started to wake up to the climate crisis and what was happening in Australia at that time. I presume you regularly do this in your journal, but if you could maybe just quickly summarise some of the more highlight events that indicate that we are rapidly moving towards this climate crisis.
Well, we could take all of our time, I think, just doing a list. You mentioned Australia and all-time record heat levels and massive bushfires that have been extraordinarily destructive. More generally, worldwide, the last 5 years are the 5 hottest years on record since records started being kept in the late 1800s. So there's certainly an enormous amount of radical change in the climate system. You know, back 15 years ago, when the term Anthropocene was sort of first being tossed about, one of the comments that was made several times in the scientific literature discussing it was that there has never been a time since human beings walked the earth when our relationship with nature changed so radically and so quickly as it is changing right now. And in fact, more generally, apart from times when the earth has been hit by an asteroid, there have not been times in which change has happened so rapidly, even in the absence of human activity. If you go back to the great extinctions of the past, there were 5 periods in the Earth's history where suddenly most of life died. But in geological terms, that's suddenly in the sense of thousands or tens of thousands of years. We are experiencing climate and related changes of that kind of scope, but they're happening in a matter of years or decades, not in millennia. And this is a quite scary prospect in many ways. There is really no doubt that we are moving or have moved into a new stage of the history of our planet, and that it is driven by human activity.
So, Ian, you talk about a new phase in the history of our planet. One of the problems, I suppose, for many younger students or young people today is just thinking about the scale of the time phase that we're looking at. I know that when I'm lecturing with my students, some of them struggle to think about the Vietnam War, its ancient history, or the Second World War is more than ancient history. But we're obviously talking about huge periods of time here. So, can you maybe give us some sort of sense of what we're talking about in terms of the Holocene and the Anthropocene? How long are these periods?
Okay, well, first of all, we talk about, if you want to talk about large lengths of time, the Earth itself is 5 billion years old approximately, which is really longer than I think most of us can wrap our minds around. And human being or terrestrial life that wasn't in the oceans, or life that was bigger than a single cell, is about 500 million years old. So you're still talking about very long periods of time. And during that time, conditions on the Earth have changed. There have been times when ice covered the whole planet. There have been times when the whole planet was tropical. And many other variations on that caused by the way the Earth goes around the sun, caused by the movement of the giant plates that make up the surface of the Earth, and so on. And what geologists do, and we are starting from geology here, is to make that understandable. They divide that history into various periods and epochs and eons, and they have a whole structure they call the geological time scale that mark off the different periods of time that different changes that have happened over time that we can tell from the geological record. Well, if we then just take that back down to the period when there have been humans around, which is perhaps 150 to 200,000 years. For most of the time that there have been humans on the ground, we were in a period of extraordinarily rapid changes in geological terms, mostly swinging back and forth between ice ages when almost everything was frozen or large parts of the planet were frozen, and warmer, more tropical periods. So our species in that time really wasn't in a position to build any cities or do anything much more than hunt and so on, hunt and gather, as they say. But about 11,000 years ago, the ice retreated for the last time, and it began a period what they call that scientists call the Holocene. The most recent is what it means, in which we've had more or less stable weather, stable climate. Remarkably stable conditions for 11,000 years. The climate hasn't varied very much. It has varied, but not very much. And it's been remarkably favorable to the development of human activity. So all of the Earth's civilizations, from the invention of agriculture, which humans did in 8 or 9 different places in the world almost simultaneously, humans figured out, hey, the climate's okay, I can now move to growing things. Well, they didn't think that way, but that was the fact. And that in turn made possible civilizations. All the great civilizations in the world, from Egypt and Greece and Rome and China and on, all occurred really in the past 5,000 to 6,000 years. And they have all occurred in this period of very stable climate conditions. When we have not had to deal with suddenly our cities being covered with ice, for example. And scientists define this as they call it the Holocene, and it's a period of, as I say, the development of human civilization has been remarkable in that period. Not always for the best, perhaps, but certainly the way we live has been dependent on that framework, the world being in those conditions. Okay. Well, what we are saying now, and what scientists have been saying now for about 20 years, is that since World War II, and really since, say, 1950, the conditions of the Holocene have started to be changed. That period of stability and consistent climate and many other things that have been consistent in the way the Earth works are suddenly being shifted out of normal. A really obvious one, and the one that gets talked about most, is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If you go back over historical records, you discover that when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it has been much warmer, and when there is less, it has been much colder. Well, there is now more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there has been since way before the Holocene started. We are radically changing one of the fundamental control knobs of the climate by driving up the greenhouse gases, which are warming the planet very rapidly. And that's one example. I mean, another one that doesn't get any publicity is nitrogen, which is a chemical that is absolutely essential for all living things. But until about 70 or 80 years ago, the supply was very limited in terms of the kinds of it that plants could use and so on. We are now artificially producing at least twice as much as nature produces. And that is changing the oceans, it is changing agriculture, it is changing the way plants grow, and it has quite remarkable implications over time. We may be able to talk about those a little bit later, but we could go on and on. There are whole books about each of these individual changes that are going on.
So just one thing that people might just want to question or think about. You said that these remarkable changes have taken place from the end of the Second World War, from the 1950s. But were many of the changes not put in place earlier in these? So you read people saying that this is, tied in with capitalism. Well, clearly capitalism has been around for 300-400 years. So what's the connection between the move towards a sort of fossil fuel-based capitalist economy and what happened after the Second World War? What's the difference between those two things?
Well, they are obviously very related. I mean, we didn't suddenly start putting new carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in 1950. We've been doing it since the 1700s. And what we see with the birth of capitalism, initially in England and then worldwide, is the burning of fossil fuels as a source of energy. I mean, prior to that, people burned wood or even coal to get warm, but burning it to make energy, to actually drive machinery, was a new thing, and it suddenly became much more large scale. And what we saw through the 1800s was a steady increase in the burning of coal, followed by, in the late of this part of the century, the discovery of the uses of petroleum and the petroleum revolution of the early 20th century, where even ever more, as the economy grew, ever more fossil fuels were being burned. I mean, fossil fuels are basically the essential energy driver of the capitalist system. Without it, capitalism would have a very tough time surviving. In fact, in my book, I refer to it as fossil capitalism that we've got. Well, what happened in the mid-20th century was a radical acceleration of that. The introduction of new and more radical technologies for using and for getting and using fossil fuels, the discovery of masses of very cheap fossil fuels, the explosion of things like plastics, which didn't exist, which are, we make things out of plastic, which are, most of the things we make are things we use once and throw away, and yet plastic is a substance that virtually never deteriorates, never goes away. It's quite strange that we do that. And you could go on and on. I mean, there are several, you come up with dozens or more things that changed in the mid 20th century. They were trends that had existed before, but what starts about 1945 or 1950 is what scientists call the Great Acceleration, the period where all of this took off. And in the beginning of around 2000 or so, a group of scientists started trying to track what had happened since the Industrial Revolution to all of these things that changed the way the planet works. And they went back and they made up a set of, ultimately turned out to be 24 graphs. 12 of them were about human activity, 12 of them were about physical changes in the Earth system. And that would include anything from carbon dioxide to the amount of forests that have been cut down and so on. And what they discovered, and if you look at the graphs are published in my book and you can find them on the web, they're quite remarkable because every single one of them shows a line that goes starting about 1750, very, very slowly increasing. And then around 1945 or 50, they suddenly go like that. You suddenly get an almost straight up turn. And it's like, this is what led them to say, we've never had a period of such rapid change as what we call the Great Acceleration. And since they did that, scientists in other fields, in oceanography and many other fields, have discovered similar, you track those activities and changes there, the disappearance of fish or the acidification of the oceans. Same kinds of graphs occur. This period that we are in is a period of extraordinarily rapid growth in our impact on the Earth system.
And I suppose that's the second aspect of what you're talking about, that it's not just about the production of carbon dioxide or carbon gases, it's the broader ecological changes that have been brought about during the Great Acceleration. The loss of fish stocks, the draining of the increased use of dams, the flooding, deforestation. These are all tied into the same period, the same era.
This is true. And the other thing, which scientists have really worked on in the past 30 years or so, see, previous to that, many of these changes were recognized, but they were viewed as local. Small, this was a change that happened somewhere and it was a small thing. But scientists, starting about 1980 or 85, started looking at the world as a system rather than as a collection of local areas. That is, and what they discover is that more carbon dioxide or deforestation have impacts that go way beyond the local areas that they occur because it's all connected. Everything's connected to everything else, as the socialist ecologist Barry O'Connor used to say. And so what we're seeing is not just local environmental problems, but a crisis of the entire Earth system, the way the planet works.
So some theorists drawn on Marx have referred to some aspects of this as a metabolic rift. What do they mean when they discuss it in those terms? What's a metabolic rift?
Well, the term comes from Marx, and Karl Marx followed the science of his day very, very closely. He was particularly interested in his time in the crisis of agriculture in England, where they were growing more and more crops, but as people moved into the cities, all the waste that people would have produced otherwise was not going back to the soil. And in order to produce for a market and make money, the issues of crop rotation was reduced and so on. And the result was the soil started to deteriorate. The crops you could get out of a single field would be lower every year. And this was widely viewed as a crisis. Well, a scientist named named von Liebig showed that in order for crops to grow, there needed to be certain chemicals in the soil, and that included nitrogen and phosphorus and other things. Nobody had really noticed that or identified that. He did very detailed studies to show it. But what he showed was that those things come out of the soil, they go into the plants, and then if the plants are shipped away, they don't go back to the soil. So what you have is a metabolic relationship between the soil and the plants and the people who would normally eat those crops and so on, which would normally be a circle or a cycle in which things come from the soil, go into the plants, are consumed by others, go back through their waste and so on. But what happened, as Marx said, was this metabolism, which was fundamental to the way life is, was suddenly broken. Because instead of the waste and so on, and excrement and everything that would traditionally have gone back to the soil, it ended up going into the sewers and into the rivers. And so in the mid-1950s, the Thames was so thoroughly polluted that Parliament couldn't meet because it smelled so bad. And Marx talked about this as a rift in the fundamental metabolism of nature, in our relationship with nature. That we were taking essential nutrients from the soil, but not returning them. Well, that concept of Marx was fairly well followed by Marxists in the 19th century and largely forgotten in the 20th century, particularly because artificial fertilizers came around and people thought the problem was solved. But it's become clear in the past few decades that we see that actually on an expanded scale now. The nitrogen artificial fertilizers that have been added turn out to create their own set of breaks in the metabolism in terms of their impact on river pollution, ocean pollution, in the atmosphere, and so on. And you can go on. So metabolic rift is a broad term that basically refers to a break or a series of breaks. I'm currently writing a book which is called Metabolic Rifts, plural, and there's a lot of them. Breaks between humanity's fundamental relationship with nature. The fact that if we don't relate to nature, if we don't work with nature, we die, because that's where we get our food, it's where we get our air, it's where we get our water. Everything we need to live comes from the natural world, but we have severed the cycles, what scientists would now call biogeochemical cycles, are being severed and disrupted by a system that works fundamentally linearly. That is, you create a product, you sell it, it gets consumed, and the waste gets discarded, rather than being cycled back to the beginning. Okay,
so these processes make life more vulnerable as we go on. Is there a link between these processes and the expansion of industrial agriculture and the metabolic rift and all the rest of it? Is there a link between these and the discovery of new viruses and diseases like what we're seeing just now? You know, is the climate crisis linked to an ecological crisis which gives rise to things like COVID-19? Are they linked or not? What's the link?
They're certainly, they are related. I think you could say actually that the climate crisis and the COVID-19 and general, crisis of pandemics in our time stem from the same source. And that is basically an economic system which must grow in order to survive, keeps expanding. And what we are seeing in particular in terms of the development of these zoonotic diseases that jump from animals to humans, is the cutting down a forest on a large scale in order to, it gets very complicated. You cut down a forest in order to grow soybeans whose purpose is to feed cows in order that people can have hamburgers. But the more forests you cut down, the less habitat there is for animals that may have been carrying these viruses for thousands of years and have had very, they have no effect on bats in particular, get mentioned a lot. Bats been carrying equivalents of COVID-19 for hundreds of thousands of years, and they're immune. But you start to get more and more contact between not just humans and wild animals, so that's usually the one that's talked about, but most often the problem is the contact between wild animals and the animals that are raised in industrial agriculture. These, the old picture of a farm, where they've got the nice silo and a couple of people holding pitchforks and, 4 pigs and a cow. If you go to a pig farm today, it will typically have, 100,000 or 200,000, or in one case that I know of, 1 million pigs at a time being raised in very cramped conditions. Their point is to move the animals through agriculture as quickly as possible at the lowest cost, in order to move more through to have more sales. But you start to get those are ideal conditions for spreading disease. Thousands of animals packed together in unsanitary conditions. And because of the way they're raised, they're all almost genetically identical. We've eliminated most of the genetic differences between these animals. So if one of them is inclined to capture, to be subject to a particular virus, they all will be. And so the various swine flus that we've experienced and the ones that have come from chickens who are raised in exactly the same conditions. Again, what you get is a jump from wild animals where these viruses have lived without any particular problem, because we have reduced their habitat so much, they're now much more likely to be in contact with the animals that end up on our plate.
So does that suggest, I know that there are some people who would argue that the common core amongst all this is, you gave an example about hamburgers or whatever, so there's just too many people consuming hamburgers, there's too many people wanting pork, there's too many people wanting chicken. So at heart, is this because human beings are voracious in our appetites? It's us that are to blame, that are at fault here?
First of all, I'm not a vegan. I rather enjoy meat. But there is no question that in the past 50 years, human consumption of meat has absolutely soared. We tend to have very short memories about this. People tend to think that the way we eat now is the way humans have always eaten. There was a presidential campaign in the United States in the 1920s where one of the candidates campaigned on the slogan of a chicken in every pot. Well, that was not today that would seem rather silly. In those days, a chicken was something you maybe had once a month or only on special occasions. Most people did not eat as much meat as we eat now, but meat is extraordinarily profitable. If you want to go into the food business, sell meat, don't sell potatoes. And so what we've had is people didn't magically say one day, hey, I'm not eating, I should eat hamburgers instead. That took advertising campaigns and marketing on a broad scale to convert from a much lower meat diet worldwide to an intensive one. And of course, the picture that being well off implies that you should have, steak on your plate every day. So this is not inherent in human nature. For most of human history, we didn't eat this way. Similarly, for most of human history, we didn't have most of the things we have. We survived quite well for most of that time. I'm not saying we shouldn't have comfort things and we shouldn't have nice food. I'm saying that this is not human nature. It's a process of a system that's built around profit, around a food system that's built around profit, and that marketing and sales play a huge role in shifting what our perceptions of what we ought to eat or ought to consume are.
So that's about consumption, but even at present day standards, and given all that, is there's surely, if we have more people in the world, they are going to consume more hamburgers or more meat given the present standards. So is it population size that we have to be concerned with?
Okay. The issue of population, the argument that overpopulation is the cause of all our problems has been with us for a very long time. It goes back at least to Malthus in the 1790s, who wrote that the world could never be a better place because every time there were more people, they'd eat all the food up and we'd all be poor again. In fact, Marx and Angus pointed out that according to Malthus, we were overpopulated from the date that there was one person or two people on the earth, because we were already eating up all the food we could make. And let me say, first of all, it's obvious there are some parts of the world that have too many people in them. Those are mostly mega cities, cities with 10 million and 15 million people, which are by every standard unsustainable. But the idea that the global problems are caused by population simply doesn't stand up. If you look at the world's population and very rough numbers, about 1% of the world's population consumes the majority of what gets consumed. There was a nice presentation done a few years ago, a professor at Yale, who basically showed that he was talking about greenhouse gas emissions, which is often, again, related to population. And what he showed is if you took the world's population and eliminated overnight 3 billion people, which would have been half of the world's population at the time that he was there, you would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by something under 1%. There's, the majority of the people of the world are not polluting it. Most of it is happening in the richest countries, and within the richest countries, it's mostly happening with a very small percentage of the population. And when we start seeing numbers, as we do see now, that a few dozen men control more than half of the US economy. Actually, I think it's under 10 now. And they are the ones who make the decisions on how we produce things. Most of us don't get a chance to vote on whether things should be wrapped in plastic or we can go to the store and choose and buy, but as I think I said somewhere, we get the choice between buying a Ford and buying a Chevrolet, but we don't get the choice between buying a car and really excellent public transit. Those just are not done, but those aren't choices we make in the marketplace. So I think the argument that population is not a non-existent cause, it has some, but on the whole, the focus on population tends to distract from the fact that all these people that we have to operate in a system in which everything is for sale, and the measure of anything is whether it can be sold, so that the ways we produce things are organized to produce profit, not organized to produce goods. I've been doing some work recently on American agriculture, and the single largest crops in the United States are corn and soy. And on the whole, people don't eat those. Those are made largely to feed cattle, but also to make ethanol to drive cars, which it makes very little sense in terms of producing the food we need, but it's very profitable for the companies that make those products.
So another argument that we sometimes hear, and I suppose that's one that seems to then think about the profit motive and maybe undermining where people's profits come in, and that is that we should, or what we need to do is aim at a more general strategy of degrowth. We have to reduce our consumption, our drive for material goods, and live more frugally in that sense. Is that the way to go? Is this the way to deal with the climate crisis?
Well, the degrowth, the people who've written about degrowth, some of them have written some very good things about the absurdities of consumerism, particularly in the wealthy countries of the world, that we buy and we use things that are destructive. They tend to have, and many of them have good insights into ways that we might well improve, ways that we could, do more with less, as the saying goes. there are a number of difficulties with degrowth as a generalized, this is how we have to do things. I mean, for example, as you might gather from what I've been saying, I think we need to eat less meat. I think that's going to be inevitable. But the fact is, there are some people in the world, and there are quite a lot of them, that don't get any meat at all. And you can go across almost anything there is. And while the wealthy countries certainly are over-consuming, the majority of the world is still living in poverty. We still have 1 billion people who go to bed hungry every night, and probably 1.5 billion to 2 billion more who are at least part of the year live in hunger. So to suggest that for them to go through degrowth is outrageous and insulting, not to mention probably racist in many ways. It seems to me that the issue is not degrowth as such, but rebalancing. That is, number one, there are certainly things we simply don't need. There's enormous numbers of things that we produce and don't need at all, and those should probably stop. But the general thrust has to be, how can we take the wealth that humanity is capable of producing? Number one, produce it in sustainable ways, and those are issues. There's some things that it's not possible with, and we'll have to make decisions about that. But number two, to make sure that people worldwide have access to those things. And that would probably mean that those of us who live in Britain, as you do, or Canada, where I live, will have less of the remarkable luxuries that we enjoy, but that the world will be a better place for it.
So I suppose at the very start we mentioned Australia, and I mean, maybe because it was in Australia that there was more focus on it, and certainly in the UK, in the press and the media. And there seemed to be for a short period of time, few days, few weeks, there was talk of governments getting together yet again and trying to make sure that they met their carbon reduction targets. We've had a number of multilateral agreements, remarkable almost in their failure to reach any targets. But in your opinion, is this the way that we have to go to try and control those? What are the positives and the negatives of those various multilateral statements and agreements?
Well, I think certainly there's going to need to be global agreements on how to on reducing greenhouse gases as a major opposite. We do need that. The problem we have is that those are right now multilateral negotiations among businesses, among governments whose main concern is protecting the businesses within their national borders or international borders. So you get endless fine words, but you end up with commitments that amount to very little. The current Paris Accord, which basically amounted to, we'll do our best and we'll let you know what we're going to do. And a lot of people said, oh, great, there's finally an international agreement that everybody signed on to. But when you looked at the voluntary commitments that were made, they were not even enough to achieve the Paris goals. And the Paris goals were very modest. They are certainly nowhere near what needs to be done in terms of phasing out fossil fuels. And so I think that while I certainly am in favor of any treaties or negotiations that can be achieved, the key, I think, is going to be to build movements that can either force governments to take real action, or alternatively change governments so that we have governments that are committed, so that we can, for example, in the case of many of the fossil fuel companies, simply shut them down. And that is not going to be done in a society in which the governments are, to say beholden to the huge corporations is to understate it.
Yeah. Okay. So Ian, I've got, just as we come to the end, I've got one question that I'd like to pose in two ways for you. So that is, what will our world look like? But then there's the first of the two parts. So what will our world look like if we don't do anything? And then the second part is, what would our world look like, or what can it look like if we start to act now?
Okay. Well, if we don't do anything or continue on the course we're on now, There are various predictions. You'll see them. There's been a number recently. Scientists have now shown how much change there will be with, and they have got some very detailed calculations showing that if we continue on our current course, we'll reach somewhere between 2 degrees and 4 degrees by the global change by the end of the century. Well, there's a couple of things to be said about that. I mean, it's interesting that they're doing those calculations and important that they're doing them. But number one, the world will continue after the next century. Our great-grandchildren are going to live in the 22nd century, and it's going to continue to get worse. So that's number one. Number two, you have to realize that those figures are averages. When you say the average temperature of the Earth will go up 2 degrees, well, yes, but that includes all the area over the 70% that's water, which is colder. Land areas are going to be warmer than that. Areas that are now warm parts of the world are going to become unbearable. In fact, there's substantial evidence that significant parts of the world, to the point where it may be areas where, depending on how warm it gets, areas where a majority of the world's population live will become intolerable. It won't be possible to work outdoors, or where it won't be possible to work where there's air conditioning, without air conditioning. And of course, air conditioning actually causes more global warming, so it makes the problem worse. So we will see, if we don't act, significant areas of the world where people are either going to have to move or die. And that's within this century. The studies that have been done are very strong on that. There's other studies that, that's just on heat. Other studies have shown that because the warmer it gets, the more rain we're going to have, so the more humid it is. And when you have the combination of heat and humidity, it's even more difficult to survive in outdoor weather. And you reach up into the point of, I don't know if you have it there, but here our weather department, our weather forecasters regularly refer to the humidex, which is how it feels. So today where I am, the temperature is going to be about 30 degrees, but when you add in the humidity, it's going to be about 39. Well, 39 is too hot to work outdoors. I mean, not just uncomfortable, but too hot after an hour or two for a person to survive. So that kind of thing will become normal in significant parts of the world. Those are things that we can expect. We can add in, of course, things like the fact that if it gets much warmer, even 2 degrees, we're going to see all the ice caps melt. Over time, it's not going to happen overnight, but it's going to happen. And about 45% of the world's population lives in areas that are going to be flooded. So you're going to have to deal with what will happen with that. How will the world change because the ice disappears? And we could go on to other changes. One that I've been doing a particular lot of research on lately relates to the more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that goes into the oceans, and that makes the oceans more acidic. And the oceans are already 30% more acidic than they were 100 years ago. Well, there's an awful lot of animals, sea animals, that can't live in acidic waters. The little ones that make their shells out of carbonate, their shells will dissolve and they'll die. And then all the bigger ones that eat them. And we could see most of the fish in the seas not just get overfished, but simply die because the oceans aren't habitable for life. So those are, and those are not 500 years from now projections. Those are in this century, and exactly when is dependent on how much or if emissions and other changes are made, emission reductions. Now, if we were able to act on it, I suppose the thing is, if I had a magic wand and like tonight we basically eliminated everything that produces carbon dioxide, and if we had a society in which economic decisions are made not in terms of private profit, but in terms of what's best for society and what's best for the long-term survival of the environment and ecological survival and so on, that is sustainable decisions. If all of those things could be done, we could head off some of those changes. Some of them are now locked in. I mean, even if we stopped producing carbon dioxide tomorrow, the amount that's in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to stay there for 1,000 years. And it doesn't just stop getting warmer, it continues to warm the air and the earth as a whole. And many of the other changes that we've made. I talked about nitrogen. the nitrogen that is now stuck in the soil and sediments of rivers. Best estimates, 35 to 50 years for that to wash out if we stopped immediately producing nitrogen fertilizers. So we are into an epoch, and as a socialist, one of the things I've been trying to talk to socialists about is that our vision of socialism is going to have to be based on what kind of a planet is it going to happen on. Marx says somewhere that people make history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. Well, even Marx didn't realize that that in our time means that building a better world is going to mean building it on a planet that is substantially less friendly than it was a century ago in terms of the ecology. And that is something we are going to have to spend a lot of time focusing on how to adapt to, but also how to reverse the changes that were caused by this horrible system in the past 100 years.
Ian, I'd just like to thank you for giving you your time over today. It's been a fascinating discussion, and for those on the course, I'm sure it's given them lots of thought to go away, read your book, and come and join the discussion with us later on. So thanks very, very much for your time and for your really thought-provoking answers to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I wish everybody in the class very well. I think it's an exciting project.